It is April, Brandenburg, Germany, and a black woodpecker, wingspan nearly half a meter, lands on a standing dead pine that a forestry crew has already marked with orange paint for removal. The bird does not hesitate. It drives its beak into the bark with a force that sends chips of dry wood spiraling down through still air. Around that tree, spreading in every direction for 4,000 hectares, stands a pine plantation so uniform, so deliberately managed, that the canopy above it casts almost no usable shadow, row after identical row of timber grown for board feet, not for life. Dr. Marcus Helt, a forest ecologist with the Brandenburg State Forest Authority, was standing just 30 meters from that tree when it happened, close enough to hear the percussion of the beak, his field notebook already open, the word "unlikely" written at the top of the page. He had expected the birds to drift outward, toward the older mixed stands at the forest margin, where the ecological complexity was obvious even to a casual observer. That is where the textbook said to look. Instead, all 20 birds moved to the interior Deadwood within the first morning of release. I am Dr. Raymond Finch, and in 40 years of watching forests fail and forests return across North America and Europe, I have never seen a living creature locate the wound of an ecosystem faster than a woodpecker finds a dying tree. All 20 birds, one morning. The interior of a plantation that official management had considered ecologically inert. Here is where it gets interesting. Marcus documented in 2019 that within just 48 hours of release, the birds had not only located the flagged dead pine, they had identified 7 additional standing deadwood candidates the forestry survey had missed entirely, trees that registered as structurally marginal but had not yet been marked. That detail matters because this plantation had been under active timber management since 1987. More than 3 decades of systematic deadwood removal, a practice standard across European commercial forestry that effectively stripped the forest of the very structures that make recovery possible. You need to understand what 3 decades of that practice produces. Not a forest, but a biological silence. A place where the architecture of decay has been so thoroughly erased that the creatures who depend on it simply stop appearing in the census data, one species at a time, until the count reaches 0 and nobody writes it down anymore. You are probably wondering whether 20 birds, just 20, could genuinely move the ecological needle on 4,000 hectares of exhausted plantation. That doubt is entirely reasonable, and the answer is going to require you to understand something about what a woodpecker actually is inside a forest system. Stay with us, because what Marcus measured in the months that followed is not what anyone predicted. What those 20 birds were about to do to that silent plantation was not restoration in any sense Marcus had been taught. It was demolition, precise, purposeful, biological demolition. And demolition, it turns out, was exactly what this forest had been waiting 32 years to receive. Straight rows of Scots pine receding into a geometry so clean it could have been drawn with a ruler, the ground beneath them swept of anything that might be mistaken for disorder. That appearance of health is one of the most consequential illusions in European land management, because what Marcus Helt's baseline surveys revealed in the season before the 20 black woodpeckers arrived was a biological structure so depleted it could barely sustain the species visibly living inside it. Now, think about what that means for a moment. Every ton of decaying timber removed under tidiness protocols did not just tidy the ground. It evicted the primary architects of renewal, one extraction at a time, across 3 full decades of methodical, well-intentioned erasure. The geographic data Marcus compiled made the scale of that erasure impossible to ignore. In the Schorfheide-Schoren biosphere reserve to the north, cavity nesting species had collapsed to just 11 pairs per 100 hectares. A density so thin, it represents near total functional silence for every secondary nester, depending on excavated hollows. Across the Spreewald lowland to the southeast, black woodpecker breeding territories had contracted to 3 documented pairs across 8,000 hectares of seemingly intact canopy. The architecture had simply been removed, and the birds had no choice but to disappear with it. In the Rupener Heide plantation belt, managers had extracted an estimated 12,000 tons of decaying timber in a single decade, and within 6 years, the wryneck and the lesser spotted woodpecker had vanished from monitoring records entirely. Along the Oder Valley corridor to the east, excavation sounds had been absent for more than 2 decades. No fresh chippings at the base of standing timber. No oval cavities cut into rotting birch. No hollow columns holding any living tenant. That figure from Ruppenerheide is worth pausing on. 12,000 tons of decaying organic material removed across a single decade, each ton representing larval habitat, fungal substrate, moisture retention, and the structural raw material that a cavity excavator converts into a nest cavity for 39 documented secondary species. What the surveys confirmed was that the plantation had not merely lost its inhabitants, it had lost the physical infrastructure those inhabitants require to exist. And without that infrastructure, no amount of canopy cover changes what the space functionally is. A structure without tenants is not a functioning ecosystem. It is a warehouse with a ceiling of green. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. Marcus had expected the surveys to show low biodiversity. That was the hypothesis. What he had not expected was the complete absence of excavation evidence across the entire 4,000-hectare interior. Not a single fresh cavity documented in the pre-release sweep of 2018. You are watching a forest that has been under active timber management since 1987. 32 years of systematic removal so efficient that the biological mechanisms of decay had effectively been switched off, and the cascade of species that depend on that decay had no entry point back in. You may be forming a doubt right now, a reasonable one, about whether 20 individuals could meaningfully reverse 32 years of structural depletion across 4,000 hectares of exhausted monoculture. That question has a precise, documented answer, and it lives in what Marcus recorded over the 14 months following the release. Stay with us, because the mechanism those 20 black woodpeckers triggered was not the one any ecologist on the project had modeled, and it did not behave at the scale anyone had predicted. What Marcus was about to measure was not the direct output of 20 excavators working on 4,000 hectares. It was a chain reaction, biological and architectural at once, that the removal of decaying timber had silenced for 3 decades, and that a single season of purposeful excavation was about to restart from the inside out. It was the one that should have stopped the program 20 years before it began. For 3 decades, Brandenburg's managed pine estates had received intensive, well-funded human intervention, and almost none of it had worked. German federal and state forestry programs had drilled nest boxes into standing trunks, erected wooden bat roosts along forest margins, and installed prefabricated raptor platforms at measured intervals. Every intervention logged, every cost audited, every structure numbered and revisited each spring by teams carrying clipboards and good intentions. An estimated 2.4 million euros had moved through those programs across 30 years, enough to pay for real restoration at scale, and instead spent on hardware that the forest could not metabolize. Marcus told me the final audit figure the way you tell someone the ending of a story they will not believe. After 30 years of intervention, cavity nesting bird diversity across the treated zones had recovered by less than 8% above baseline. Marcus described that figure to me as statistically indistinguishable from doing nothing. And he was not being unkind. He was being precise. The nest boxes worked for great tits, a resilient, adaptable species that will raise a brood in a drain pipe if the dimensions are right. They did not work for the 47 other species that need something a drill bit cannot replicate. Compressed resin-sealed walls, a precise excavation depth, and a fresh insulating layer of wood chips that a living bird lays down from the inside out. Here is where the data stops being data and becomes something else entirely. Because what you are looking at is not a failed experiment. You are looking at 3 decades of institutional certainty that human engineering could substitute for a process that took 40 million years of evolution to calibrate. The Forestry Board was not careless. They were overconfident in the precision of their own tools. A naturally excavated cavity is an architecture in 4 layers. The outer entry shaft, shaped by beak angle and force. The mid-chamber widened for incubation space. The sealed resin walls that regulate interior humidity. And the wood chip floor the bird deposits fresh with every visit, which insulates against temperature swings that would kill a clutch of eggs overnight. No prefabricated insert replicates all 4. When the Brandenburg Forest Authority proposed introducing woodpeckers to the plantation interior, the Regional Forestry Board filed a formal written objection. Two concerns, on record: damage to commercially viable standing timber and wind-throw liability from excavation in load-bearing pines. The objection was noted, and then the birds went in anyway. In 2019, in their first full season of work, 20 woodpeckers produced more functional nesting architecture than 30 years of human drilling had generated in the same forest zone. You need to let that land for a moment before we talk about what it actually means for the 48 species still waiting. You are probably asking right now whether the Forestry Board's concern was completely wrong, whether any commercial timber was lost, whether wind-throw did occur, whether there was a cost the ecologists did not want to admit. That answer is coming, and it is not the one the board expected to receive. They did not drill a hole, they built a system. And the cascade that system triggered in the 14 months that followed is what Marcus spent the next field season trying to measure before he was certain enough to put his name on it. The first black woodpecker landed, a 45-centimeter silhouette dropping onto standing Deadwood with the practiced certainty of something that had been doing this long before Brandenburg had a name. What happened at the surface looked like destruction: 20 blows per second, bark splitting, pale chips raining into the needle litter below. But every strike was a surgical extraction, pulling wood-boring beetle larvae from galleries tunneled centimeters beneath the outer layer of dying pine. Think of the excavation in 3 physical layers. The bark comes off first, exposing larval galleries that honeycomb the sapwood. The larvae are extracted and consumed, and the raw wood left behind, moist, fibrous, open to spore, begins to soften within 72 hours of that first strike. Within 72 hours of that first excavation, Marcus documented something his monitoring protocol had not anticipated. Dung beetles had arrived in the fresh wood chip debris at the base of the pine. Not introduced, not relocated. They had been waiting in the soil beneath the plantation for exactly this material, and the material had finally arrived. By the close of the first breeding season, 20 woodpeckers had opened 34 active cavities across the plantation interior, each one averaging 35 centimeters deep and 12 centimeters wide, each one holding a chamber temperature 8 degrees warmer than the ambient air outside in a Brandenburg February. 9 of those cavities were occupied by nuthatches within the same season, and 4 were taken by stock doves before Marcus had finished tagging them. But the arrival that stopped the monitoring team was a pair of Tengmalm's owls, a nocturnal hunter, absent from this plantation for more than 15 years, nesting in one cavity before the mapping was complete. Stay with this, because if you are thinking that one pair of owls returned after 15 years of absence sounds like a modest result for a full monitoring season, you are asking exactly the right question, and the answer is not about the owls. It is about what happened directly beneath the canopy once they began to hunt. Marcus tracked the cascade in sequence. Woodpecker opens cavity, secondary nester occupies it, apex predator returns to fill the vacancy at the top of the food chain, and rodent pressure on the ground layer drops measurably. A chain no model in the project's original design had included as a variable. The thermally regulated chambers, each holding a consistent differential of 8 degrees above ambient, are not incidental comfort. They are the physical reason secondary nesters succeed in late winter cold snaps that would otherwise kill clutches laid in exposed or shallow nests. The woodpecker does not restore the plantation. It opens one cavity, and every species downstream was already present in the soil, the canopy, and the surrounding edge, waiting for the door. What happens next, once those Tengmalm's owls begin to reshape the ground beneath the canopy, is the part of the data Marcus almost did not include in his report, because he was not sure anyone would believe the numbers. He told me that directly, standing in his office in Brandenburg with his field notes spread across the table. He wanted to finish counting first, because the numbers were doing something he had not seen in 3 decades of forest monitoring. The project boundary had been drawn at the plantation edge, a clean administrative line on a management map. By the second breeding season, 6 pairs had crossed it entirely, moving into an adjacent mixed-age stand that the regional authority had explicitly classified as commercially productive and excluded from the intervention. What Marcus found inside that adjacent stand when he finished his spring survey was 11 new excavation sites, drilled into timber that the Forestry Board had argued, just months earlier, needed protection from exactly this kind of damage. The birds had found that stand in under 8 months, not guided, not tracked. They had located standing deadwood that the managed plantation lacked, resources the human survey had not flagged, and they had moved toward it the way water moves toward lower ground, because that is precisely what it was, the path of least structural resistance. A formal complaint arrived from a private timber operator whose lease overlapped the new territories. Filed in 2021, it cited damage to 3 commercially staged trees, excavation, scarring on timber that had been scheduled for harvest. The damage was real. The scarring was documented. Marcus did not dispute a single photograph in the complaint, because the excavation marks were visible, measurable, and precisely where the operator said they were. What the complaint omitted was the condition of the trees underneath those marks. You are probably asking right now whether Marcus could actually prove the timber was already compromised, whether a week of coring after the fact was enough to hold against a formal legal filing. That answer comes out of the lab results he submitted to the regional authority, and it reframes every assumption the complaint was built on. Stay with this. His team cored all 3 trees within the following week. Each showed the same internal profile: early fungal staining in the heartwood, a softening of the central column consistent with foam's fomentarious colonization, and an outer shell that still looked commercially viable from a standard exterior walkthrough survey. The birds had found diseased timber. A standard forestry walkthrough had not. That is not an editorial. That is what the core samples documented, submitted on record to the Brandenburg Regional Authority by Marcus Helt of the Brandenburg State Forest Authority in the spring of 2021. When a wild animal exceeds the boundary you drew for it, the correct first question is not how do we stop it. It is what did it find there that we missed? What the mixed stand now holds, and what it is beginning to do to the soil chemistry in the 560 meters of transition zone between the 2 stands, is what Act 6 documents. Not a surprise to Marcus Helt, it was a confirmation of something he had suspected since 2019, standing 30 meters from a dead pine while 20 black woodpeckers dispersed into the interior on their first morning of release. The cavity had always been there, not as a gap in the wood, but as a gap in the system, a hollow shaped by 3 decades of removal that the forest was waiting, with extraordinary patience, to refill the moment the pressure eased. What Marcus logged in his final site assessment, submitted to the Brandenburg Regional Record in 2021, showed that 34 secondary cavity users had colonized the plantation within 24 months of the initial woodpecker release. Nuthatches, stock doves, pine martins, and 3 species of bat, none of which had been recorded on the site since active management began in 1987. That number, 34 species using architecture that did not exist 2 years earlier, is not a metaphor for resilience. It is a load-bearing fact. A cavity carved by a beak becomes insulated nesting space, thermoregulated and rainproof, that no planting program and no reseeding grant can manufacture from scratch. The plantation had been under continuous management pressure since 1987. Every dead tree removed, every snag cleared, every cavity filled before it could be occupied, for 32 consecutive years. What Marcus documented beginning in 2019 was not restoration. It was the cessation of subtraction. You might be forming a reasonable doubt right now, wondering whether 24 months of recolonization is simply a pulse, a brief surge that fades once the novelty of the cavities passes. That doubt deserves a direct answer, and the core sample data from the transition zone provides it. Stay with this. What the soil recorded changes the frame entirely. The cavity system functions in 3 interlocking layers. The outer excavation accelerates fungal ingress into the heartwood. The inner chamber provides nesting insulation for secondary species, and the expelled wood chips form a nitrogen-rich mulch ring at the base, a closed loop of decomposition that feeds the root system directly below. What happened in that Brandenburg plantation is not a miracle, and it is not a policy victory. It is physics. Remove the pressure, leave the dead trees standing. The system returns to its equilibrium. That is not hope. That is biology doing what biology has always done. and Marcus Helt spent 4 years documenting it at the resolution the record required. Drop your region and one species you have personally watched disappear from your area in your lifetime in the comments. And yes or no in the comments. Have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent because the evidence says otherwise. Next, we are going to the River Otter catchment in the Scottish Highlands, where 6 Eurasian beavers raised the local water table by an average of 34 centimeters within 4 years, reconnecting ancient fen, flooding farmland, and forcing a conversation nobody in that valley was prepared to have. Scottish Natural Heritage opposed that reintroduction formally in 2007, citing agricultural risk. And every farm within 2 kilometers of the release site saw its drainage costs shift within the first wet season. Whether the land that flooded was a loss or a return is the question the next film answers. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I'll see you in the field.